bin Laden. But now they say, no, domestic groups, they're the terrorists. So we're going to be going over all of this because the world is getting more and more insane. And now when you start hearing them talk about imminent collapse of the euro and then the dollar and J.P. Morgan and all of this to give us the real state of the world financial system, to give us a real breakdown on it, Webster Tarpley joins us. And then in the second half of the interview, after he gives us the geopolitical current breakdown, I'm going to sit back and try to ask very few questions and give him the floor in the second half to roll through his ideas for a solution. Now, some of you who are more constitutional or libertarian, you know, you're not going to like kind of the FDR-style ideas, but I've promised to just put these ideas out there because Tarpley, who I respect when it comes to his analysis, thinks this is the only solution. That does not mean I'm endorsing it, but I'm not scared to hear other ideas. And then at the end of the interview, I'll write a few notes, and I'll have some counterpoints to what Webster is saying. But undoubtedly, the Republican leadership doesn't tell you about the majority of where the money's going, and that's to corporate welfare and inside crony scams. They want to point all day at the welfare crowd when they've already shipped their jobs overseas. So Tarpley's right on that front, and he predicted much of what unfolded with Rand Paul a few weeks before it did unfold, and was proven right on that front to a great extent. So he joins us now from right outside D.C. in Maryland. Dr. Tarpley, great to have you here. Thank you. Let the 60 minutes begin. Give us your forecast, your breakdown, the waterfront of what's happening in the world today, and the fact that now, headline after headline, Chinese pulling money out of the stock market, global implosion, banks told get ready for implosion. What's happening?
Well, the starting point is the big reality is a world economic depression. It's a world economic depression similar to that of the 1930s, but in many ways worse than what we had in the 1930s. We've been in a depressed world economy in that sense since 2008 at the very latest, right? September 2008, the Lehman Brothers weekend around September 15th. This had been signaled by the bankruptcy of Bear Stearns back in the springtime in March. But then by the time we got to September, it's clear that every bank in Wall Street, and we saw them all, right? We saw AIG, we saw Merrill Lynch, we saw every bank essentially bailed out, given Treasury money through the TARP, but then given even more in 0% Federal Reserve loans, and that included foreign banks, right up to the tune of 25 or 27 trillion dollars. And since then, we've had various initiatives going on, mainly that if you're a zombie bank or a hedge fund hyena, you can go to the Federal Reserve and you can borrow at 0% interest rates in the United States, or 1%. Similarly, if you're a zombie bank in Europe, you can go to the European Central Bank and get money for 1%. But this, the problem with this is this has not produced a recovery, because all of that credit is being absorbed by this mass, this cancerous growth of about $2 quadrillion, that is to say 2,000 trillion dollars of bankrupt kited derivatives that are clogging the banking system. And this means credit default swaps, collateralized debt obligations, structured investment vehicles, all sorts of combinations of those. So you're in a depression now. Not every area of the world was immediately dragged into the depression. The depression actually started more or less simultaneously in the United States and Great Britain. On the British side, you remember Northern Rock, a very big bank, blew up in October of 2007 already, and followed then by Royal Bank of Scotland, which at the time was the biggest bank in the world. So these have all blown up. And now in the meantime, we've also seen the corruption, right? LIBOR, the LIBOR fixing scandal, which goes back to 07, 08, but continues probably up to the present day. That is about 16 of the very biggest banks in the world. It essentially shows that you're dealing with a cartel. You're dealing with a world banking cartel of 16 or thereabouts large zombie banks. I say zombie banks because they're they're all bankrupt and they're all kept going using government resources. But the problem is they don't have any positive social function anymore. They don't issue loans for commercial banking purposes. They don't do anything for plant, equipment, business investments, capital formation, and so forth. What they do is speculate. They drive up the price of gasoline. They drive up the price of food commodities and similar things. They rip off their own customers with fees, and they foreclose on real estate and loot the population that way. So we're in the middle of this. Now, if you look at the responses of the ruling class, I think it's pretty clear there's a growing consensus in the world ruling class. I mean, the kind of people who come together at Bilderberg, or the people who control the European Central Bank and the Federal Reserve and things like this, and the political parties, needless to say. Obama is a creature of Wall Street. He's a Wall Street puppet. And then we have the new combination, the Romney-Ryan combination, which they intend to carry forward the Wall Street program with, I think, even greater criminal energy, even greater aggressiveness, right? Because they want to show that they're new and they're full of fight, right? And they want to flay the U.S. population alive. The consensus that I can see is austerity, and austerity means cuts. It means a psychosis that when you're in a depression, you've got to cut budgets. You've got to destroy the social safety net. You've got to strip people of their economic rights. And this you can see in Europe, right? You look at the conditions that were dictated to Greece, but also Spain, Portugal, Ireland, Italy is now coming, Greece also. All of this amounts to essentially posing the question, we have a depression, who should pay for the depression? This is the only real political question that we have. And the answer from the ruling class is working people pay for the depression. The middle class pays for the depression, the upper middle class even, poor people, working class people. That's who pays for the depression. And I would say that answer means genocide. If you
Sure. Let me just now interject a point, because you've made so many. They phrase it in the right-wing, left-wing debate, though, that if you say don't make the poor or the middle class pay, oh, you want rich people to have higher taxes to pay for your free welfare. That's not what's happening. In the Obama deception, you go over the first banker bailout numbers, and this was even in mainstream news, back of the paper, where you'd have over 90% of it was corporate welfare and bailouts to the ultra-rich. But somehow since then they've spun it, even though in Europe it's mainly their fake debts that they got government to sign on to, too big to fail, to where, oh, it's those lazy French or those lazy Germans or those lazy Greeks when they're working very hard over there. Sure, they may get a week more of vacation than us. We get 2-3 weeks, they get 4. But the point is that it's incredible for somebody like myself who pays some attention to economics and what's really going on, that they've done such a good job of scapegoating people. But as you point out, when they get the austerity in Greece or Argentina or wherever they've done it in the last 15 years, it implodes the tax revenue. So the bankers, that's why I say it's on purpose. Right. They know that when they raise taxes on the poor or cut benefits or the middle class, that it actually drives down tax receipts. So why do they want to drive things into oblivion? I mean, right there, Max Kaiser ran into Steve Forbes in Greece a few months ago during a bunch of rioting, and he was there at a conference bragging, oh, things are imploding, we're buying everything up cheap. So, I mean, doesn't that show they know what they're doing?
No, I don't think it does. I think that's sort of a commentary on the backside of accomplished fact, right? That's the wisdom that comes after the fait accompli.
Hindsight's 20/20.
Yeah. The problem that you have is when you have a speculative-minded group of finance capitalists, right? You have financiers who fundamentally are not interested in industry or agriculture, right? They're not even at the level of Andrew Carnegie or Henry Ford, right? They're at the level of ripoff, right? They want short-term paper profits, and they figure that speculation, which in our time means, of course, derivatives, these, again, the collateralized debt obligations, credit default swaps, and all the rest of this. They think that that actually represents wealth. Because
sure, they want post-industrial world, and they say they do. In fact, it's not that they're not at the level of Henry Ford or Carnegie with steel and Coke. They know what they're doing. They're at odds against production. Henry Ford wanted to pay the workers well so they could buy his car. He wanted an economy. They want the post-industrial. Why is that?
Well, again, let's not be too nice to Henry Ford. He financed Hitler, did a lot of very bad things.
Oh, no, but I wasn't praising him on the Hitler thing, Tarpley.
Sure.
I was stating that he understood you've got to have a market.
At least sometimes he did, right? And I think, unfortunately, as he went along, he understood it less and less. But the idea is the power of an industrialist faction. You don't really see this in the U.S. You see it in China. You might even see it in Japan. In Russia, you see a lot of people who are industrialists, even if it's extractive industries, but not here. The Anglo-Americans have built their house on speculative paper, and that means derivatives. Now, the problem that they have is they live for the next bubble. We saw it with Greenspan, right? Bubbles Greenspan. He went from the irrational exuberance of the wealth effect, the housing bubble. Then we had the Latin American loan bubble before that. Then we had the dot-com bubble. Then we went back to the housing bubble. They feel that they can't make their system work without a series of bubbles. And once they see a bubble, it's like a heroin addict. I don't think there's any element of calculation. This is a very important point, because what I'm saying is that this ruling class is a highly political question. This ruling class is incompetent. They are incapable of ruling. And if you want to do anything serious, you got to face that problem, that your ultimate bedrock problem is not even this policy or that policy, but you've got to take power out of the hands of a ruling elite of financiers.
Sure, so let me stop you. I mean, I always hear the demonization of industrialists, but that sounds great. That's jobs, that's building things up, that's farms, that's mobility, that's all sorts of people to work on the machines. But, I mean, so basically what you're saying is, correct me if I'm wrong, is they've created a cosmology of post-industrial where they've romanticized wrecking societies because they are out of control like cancer. That's what they do. And so they lie and say, oh, that was our plan to wreck everything, and have believed their own delusion.
They're shameless opportunists. And Steve Forbes, you know, the toothy geek, as he was once called, right? Presidential candidate. He ran on a tax plan that would have essentially, you know, given a free ride to rich parasites like himself. This is also somebody who inherited the money, right? The money was made by Malcolm Forbes. So this is now a no-talent, you know, idiot's son who arrives and takes over the company and spent a lot trying to become president.
Now, wait a minute. Steve Forbes in the publishing world is doing really better than most people right now.
Yeah, he probably hired some people who know what to do, because he certainly doesn't. Anyway, the point is, what Steve Forbes was doing over there was the U.S. essentially succeeded in exporting this depression to Europe. There is no European debt crisis. The answer to the European debt crisis, and I think you were getting close to this before, if Deutsche Bank or Societe Generale or Barclays Bank bought Greek bonds and Greece can't pay, that's too bad for Deutsche Bank, Societe Generale, and Barclays Bank. They go bankrupt, except they can't because they're too big to fail. So what we have in Europe is the triumph of neoliberal monetarist ideology, which says that if Greece can't pay, then Greeks have to die, right? They have to be killed through austerity, take away their health care, they die, take away their unemployment benefits, their food subsidies, they die. And a lot of them are also killing themselves, right? In Greece and Italy, you can see that the ultimate effect of an anti-people austerity policy, right? Again, draconian cuts, genocidal fascist cuts that can't be imposed under democratic conditions, is that people begin to kill themselves. Now,
all right, listen, we're going to get into all that, but I specifically, and I'm going to give you the floor to break down what you think are the solutions here, Webster, but I want to get into, you mentioned things like LIBOR. The average person has heard of that, interest rate fixing, but the magnitude, this confirms everything we were saying, that they were fixing it for free money for themselves to loan shark and gouge us. I want you to talk about LIBOR, but also, what does it signify that now for the first time, they are all over every elite publication saying global meltdown, total collapse, 1.4 billion rounds of 40 cal, hollow point, dum-dum bullets, drones, troops. I mean, for the first time, they're going from denying all this to gearing it up. Does that A, mean they're getting ready for the collapse, or B, are they getting ready to hold people hostage again, like Paulson did in October of 2008, saying, you give us unlimited corporate welfare to too big to fail, or we're going to drop the hammer and have martial law? What is it?
Well, the first thing, of course, is the basic reality is that if you have a world economic depression of these proportions, right, and it now exists in the United States, in North America, I think pretty much in general, it certainly has come to Europe. China is slowing. India is slowing. They haven't been quite as bad. You can see that the whole Mediterranean basin, the Arab world, is in deep distress. The high unemployment and high food prices are really the basis of the fraud called the Arab Spring. So, yeah, if you don't deal with the depression, civilization will collapse, right? In other words, everything that you've mentioned, those are simply predicates of the fact that if you have a depression and it goes on and on and on, civilization will collapse. The institutions upon which human society depends will be wiped out. Now, LIBOR, again, it simply means that there's a cartel, that this interest rate that was reported every morning was doctored, it was fixed, it was done for different reasons, right? Sometimes they wanted it higher than it really was, sometimes they wanted it lower. There are about $600 trillion or $800 trillion of derivatives around the world, including euro-dollar derivatives, that depend on that London interbank offered rate. And people who invested in that have been ripped off, right? The city of Baltimore is suing for $50 billion, and there are all kinds of other lawsuits. I think, though, what we have to focus on is events in the real economy. In other words, consumption, employment, wages, human longevity, things like this. The idea that there's going to be another financial panic, yeah, of course, a financial panic could emerge at any point. I would also say that a lot of the stuff that you cite, these articles have an axe to grind. In other words, they have a bias. Anybody in Britain or the United States who writes about the euro or tells you that the euro is going to crash is part of whether they know it or not, they're part of an effort to destroy the euro. In other words, it's a way to export the depression, right? It started in 2009, right? Basically, Christina Romer had studied these things, how flight capital from the U.S. or into the U.S. from Europe was a big thing in the 1930s. So she basically said, how could we get flight capital once again? And then they farmed this out to Soros and company and to the idea dinner at Moness, Crespi and Hart. So they succeeded in exporting this depression so that the center of it is now Europe. And this is what has served to prop up the dollar. So yes, of course, there could be a cataclysmic financial panic at any moment, right? And it would take any kind of an outside event could do that. But once again, I'm not so interested in the financial aggregates. I'm interested in the fate of human beings and of the society. And here's what I'm getting at. There's a group in the United States of about 50 million people, 50 million. And this group is now in grave danger of genocide. In other words, death on a mass scale. And here's the way it looks. The 50 million, first of all, don't have jobs because there are no jobs, right? My estimate of the real unemployment in the United States is about 30 million plus. If you take the the Department of Labor U6 unemployment, you get up to about 23 million or so. I think 30 million is a good round number. It's interesting. This was taken up by this guy, Dylan Radigan, on MSNBC. For what reason, I don't know. But after I'd been saying 30 million for quite a while, he picked it up.
No, Webster, I agree with you. I want to go over some of those real numbers. But just to be clear, when I read 5 or 6 headlines here, that was not an attempt to say the euro was going under. I was giving you a smattering at the start of the interview.
Yeah, of course.
Of the fact that they're admitting the crisis is deepening. Let me just go over some of those again since you mentioned it. Chicago Tribune running Reuters. In the U.S., they're saying prepare to, quote, prevent a collapse during a collapse. And then I showed Der Spiegel, investors prepare for euro collapse. Okay, so I mean, more and more they're saying there's no way to bail that.
Spiegel, notorious British intelligence rag from
great.
Hamburg. Hamburg, center of British influence.
I understand. I'm just going over.
And I know these people. I probably know who wrote it. I'm not sure.
Okay, let me tell you who wrote it. Martin Hess.
Martin Hess. No, I didn't.
Okay, continuing. It was a smattering of headlines. There wasn't some code in it. I just grabbed these off my desk. I covered it on the radio. Here's another one. Chinese companies pull out of U.S. stock market. I see that as big. They're not buying as many as our treasuries.
But this could also reflect the weakness of China. In other words, they may be leaving because they got plenty to do at home.
I'm hearing a lot of that from people that are smart like you. Okay, here's another one. Treasury, losses on bailouts. I'm just trying to, Rome shops in trouble. I mean, my point is they've been papering over things, saying everything worldwide is wonderful. The recession ended almost 4 years ago. You and others said that's balderdash. It's been admitted balderdash. They're fixing unemployment numbers. They're fixing numbers on inflation. That's all admitted. My question was, hey, they're admitting things are getting really bad. Why are they doing that? I know they've got axes to grind. I was asking you why.
There's a constant process of admitting, right, that there's a depression. Let's take that one, right? The most obvious is there a depression? Yes. Paul Krugman, Nobel Prize winner on the faculty at Princeton, has a book, Let's End This Depression. Quite a few other people have said depression. Newt Gingrich said the Obama depression back in the springtime in the Republican debate. So yeah, there's a depression, and then within the depression, and that has never changed. You never got out of the depression. There's no recovery. It's not a recession. It's a depression. There hasn't been a recovery, but there are attempts to create bubbles within the depression, and it's what we're talking about now. Is will there be another collapse of a new derivatives bubble?
And that's why we've got you here. Okay, because I want to get into this with you right now here. This is complex issues. What are the new bubbles? Obviously, food, farmland, things like that, military stuff. What are the new bubbles, and what do you expect to be the different break points? I mean, I know it's hard to tell because they're not even in full control. But what are you looking at? What do you see happening?
Well, whenever there are objective reasons, for example, the U.S. drought and similar things around the world, it's an objective basis to cover a wave of speculation, right? So as soon as something like this happens, the speculators come in and they make everything worse. And they use derivatives, right? They use various kinds of commodity index derivatives and synthetic derivatives.
Naked shorting, computers, flash trading.
Yeah, derivatives. So the obvious one is the oil price, right? There's a general idea that the oil price can only go up. So it's generally estimated that Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley between them account for maybe $10 or $15 of the price of a barrel of oil, right? Which is now in the 80s. By the way, if you want to deal with that, that's something you can deal with very, very specifically. You can ban these commodity derivatives. You just outlaw them. You have position limits. It says if you want to enter the oil market, you can buy 5% of the oil market, no more. You have to distinguish between end users and speculators.
Well, I'll say this. I mean, these speculators want new taxes for me to pay them banker bailouts. I want to get into solutions, but let's talk about some of them now. But I've got a few more questions before we get into that whole diatribe, because I want you to have the floor on that.
The big one is obviously derivatives. In other words, the derivatives, they haven't gone down; they've gone up. At the time of the crisis, I was
sure they use bailout money to engage in more speculation. So what do you do? A 1% tax?
Yeah. Look, again, with derivatives, it's very specific. Some you ban. Let's take collateralized debt obligations. If you remember, a year ago this spring, Lloyd Blankfein of Goldman Sachs appeared before the Senate, right, when Senator Levin was reading this thing about this obscene a report about, what a piece of crap these CDOs were that he was selling. At the end of the day, in one of his TV interviews, even Blankfein said, maybe we should just outlaw credit default swaps. Yes, exactly. Outlaw credit default swaps. You ban them. They were illegal in the United States from 1936 to 1982 under the Commodity Exchange Act. This is the series of New Deal things that prevented the Depression.
Sure, Webster, I want you to stop because in 10 minutes we go to the half hour where I'm giving you the floor to get into solutions.
I'm not going to talk about
listen.
solutions. I'm just saying, even Blankfein said you can ban them, right?
No,
the other
stop.
Collateralized.
Stop. I want to get into solutions and your ideas because I respect them, but I want to stop there before we run out of time here. This is riveting. Let's go here because most shows don't have these big, long, in-depth interviews. How does war, how does Al-Qaeda, how does trying to get Shiites and Sunnis into a global civil war, how does that feed in? Because obviously there's not just economics, there's warfare, there's other ingredients. So you've been to these countries just recently. You've been there under bombardment in Libya and in war zones in Syria. We respect your courage on that front more than I have. Tell us how that feeds in, and because you know how to look over the horizon.
Sure.
What do you expect to happen geopolitically, or what are some of the storm clouds we should look to form? I mean, I want to know this. The viewers want to know. Break down some of the different futures you see, and then I'm going to sit back, buddy, for 30 minutes. In about 8 minutes, I'm looking at the clock over there, and tell us what you would do solution-wise. I hope you've got a raft of notes there because you're going to have the floor.
The foreign policy approach is that the U.S. and the British and similar, the Frankfurt and Paris and what have you, they have to loot the world. They have to sack and loot and exploit this planet and humanity on the planet. And the problem that they always have is you can work through puppet states in, Europe, right? There were no real independent countries left in Europe. They've all knuckled under to NATO and the European Central Bank, which gets you back to London and Wall Street. But in other parts of the world, there are nation states that fight back. And the nation state is the absolutely essential way you fight these neo-feudalist financiers. In other words, the bankers believe in neo-feudalism. The banks are at war with the modern state. And you see it most clearly in the Middle East. You look at these people like Ben Ali of Tunisia, Mubarak of Egypt, Gaddafi of Libya, Assad of Syria. What have they done, right? Most of these people, some of them at least, were puppets, if you like, of the U.S. Mubarak more or less was that, although not quite. But the problem is these are puppets that can say no. The IMF comes in and says, abolish the food subsidy, go to a free market in bread. Well, that's going to quadruple the price of bread. There are going to be riots. So Mubarak says no. Similar things like this. The nation state tends to erect a barrier against the amount of looting that the foreign bankers can impose. And
the nation state is a firewall. The nation state is a firewall.
Absolutely. And it's true for us, too. You can see this in Brzezinski. He talks about microstates, mini-states as the way to have dignity, that you got to have a microstate that looks just like you, right? If you're a Druze, you can't be part of Syria. You got to have a microstate. If you're an Alawite, not Syria, but a microstate. There's an editorial about that in the Washington Post this morning. If you're a Lebanese Maronite, got to be a special state for you. If you're a Kurd, there's got to be Kurdistan.
So divide and conquer the great
divide
game.
And conquer. And Soros calls it partition studies. In other words, there's a whole academic discipline. How do you destroy the modern nation state and replace it with these rump states, microstates, mini-states, failed states?
And that's what multiculturalism is trying to get us all fighting with each other, and then the establishment plays the part of the gatekeeper, the arbiter, the referee.
Right. The left-wing version is multiculturalism, but the right-wing version is secessionism, states' rights, all this stuff. Because you push that, you're going to get the breakup of the large nation states. The British are doing this to themselves. They use the British Isles as a kind of a show window for their policies, right? Scotland, if Scotland secedes from the United Kingdom, they're not really seceding because they'll still have the Queen as the head of state. The Bank of England or the Bank of Scotland, same thing, will run the show, right? They'll still be part of the IMF. They won't have sovereignty. They'll still be in the European Central Bank. They won't, or European Union. They won't have sovereignty at all. But the idea is they'll be easier to deal with. You got to imagine if I'm J.P. Morgan Chase or ExxonMobil or Halliburton, who do I want to deal with? Do I want to deal with Syria, which is a country of 25 million people with an army and an air force, or do I want to deal with an independent Druze, Kurd, Alawite, Shiite entity? I'll deal with the little ones. In other words, the pathetic, little squabbling, impotent things that have no hope of resisting when you play one against another, and it just becomes an endless process. So that's the idea. But there's an economic reason for that. Look what they did in Libya, right? You destroy Libya. Libya is now a shambles, but the oil contracts have now been renegotiated under terms that are worse than what Gaddafi got, worse for Libya, but better for the international multinational oil companies.
Sure, so we get to looting briefly here then. How are things going geopolitically for the globalist? What do you expect them to do in Iran?
Look, we just had a real big landmark event, right? That was last week. I think it must have been last Friday. It was the Tehran Consultative Conference on Syria. This was a landmark. I've never seen anything like this in recent decades. This is an international conference, and who's going to be there? Well, Iran are the hosts, so Iran. Russia, China, India are all represented, but it doesn't stop there. Pakistan, Mrs. Rabbani, the foreign minister, comes and she says, no foreign intervention in Syria, under no circumstances. Indonesia, you've already got about half the world, but it goes on. Then you got Kazakhstan, huge place. Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Belarus. It's 30 countries, 30, and they represent half the world because you got Russia, China, India, Pakistan, Indonesia, Iran, right? Big, important, Venezuela, influential countries.
They're not going to the controlled UN. They're setting up their own league.
Yeah, in effect. And half of these people were at the ministerial level, foreign minister, deputy foreign minister. The rest of them were ambassadors, but some of the smaller countries, right? Smaller Latin American countries couldn't send somebody especially for this. But this was a real big thing. And I noticed now that Hillary Clinton is more hysterical than ever because her job is supposed to be make sure nothing like that ever happens. And now it's happened. There's a kind of I would call it a block for national independence, for state sovereignty, and national dignity.
An anti-New World Order, anti-genocide group.
Right. Yes, exactly. And it's a powerful combination. Now, obviously, there are a lot of problems, and it needs to be developed. But it's a step beyond these things like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization
and BRICS.
And the BRICS.
All right, listen, we're out of time.
Short-term and task-oriented.
We're out of time. We've already done over 30 minutes here. So I want to sit back, get into what you would do if you could convince the electorate, or if you could get the electorate to do what you wanted, or you had a magic wand. What would you do geopolitically to stop the globalists? Because even if we had the votes, they would just stage terror attacks and blame it on us. So how do you geopolitically, militarily, economically outmaneuver the globalists whose stated goal is bankrupt the world, bankrupt the family, and inject us all with cancer viruses? How do we deal with that?
And for this, we got about 30 minutes, right?
Yeah, go. You got it.
Okay. Well, the first thing is you got to have a mass movement. It's got to be an independent mass movement. Without a mass movement, there's no solution really to anything. It's got to be independent of the Republican Party, independent of every single politician in the Republican Party, and similarly, independent of the Democratic Party and independent of every single one of them. Now, obviously, as time goes on, you're going to be getting pieces of those parties to come and join you. But the idea is you're independent. And it's perfectly possible that at some point you might want to poach in the Democratic or Republican or anybody else's primary. But you need a mass movement. Now, let's look at an attempt in this direction that succeeded lately. Okay? We can think of all the ones that failed, right? Everything in the Republican primaries, Ron Paul, I think that failed. And you can also say then that on the other side, Occupy Wall Street was wrecked by ad busters and David Graeber and a bunch of anarchists and Michael Moore and these people who came in. The one that succeeded is Syriza, right? The left-wing bloc of Greece. They went from 4% to about 27, 28%. So they had almost 600% growth. And they scared the living daylights out of the whole world financier ruling class between May and June. And so this is a very, very formidable thing. They're now the opposition in Greece. The news from Greece is all bad. Austerity cuts that are done with the promise that they're going to balance the budget never balance the budget. It can't be done that way. Everybody who proposes austerity, doesn't matter who it is selling snake oil because they say, carry out my cuts and we'll balance the budget. No, you never will, because in a depression, you're just making it worse. And what the Greeks have found is that the deficit gets bigger and bigger. The more you cut this year, the bigger the deficit next year, because you're cutting. The only activity that really exists is activity around the state sector. So that's that. Now, Syriza, what can we learn from it? 5 things, I think, what you need. First of all, you need a program, and I want to talk about program more than anything, but you've got to have an actual program of demands. Notice with the Occupy Wall Street, their idea was you should not have any demands. If you have demands, you're going to be co-opted. This is absolutely insane, right? This is absolute garbage. This is the kind of thing that a ruling class counterinsurgency agent tells you to do. They usually come dressed as anarchists. So you've got to have a program. You got to have an identity. You've got to be able to talk to other people in the society and say, look, I'm not just doing this for my own narrow parochial interest, but I'm interested in fighting battles that will benefit the entire society. Okay, so we'll get to program in a minute. The second thing you need is an organization. The leadership of Syriza was able to put together 12 different groups to make a political party to get to 4% in the beginning, right, to reach critical mass. So that meant sects, groups, organizations, splinter parties, pieces of old, political formations that hadn't gone anywhere. Put them together. That was obviously a big effort because you had to convince people to give up their petty grievances and their feuds and all this other stuff. Naturally, the fact that the society was helping probably was collapsing probably helped. So you got to have an organization. You got to have a leader, and it turned out, or a leadership, better. That's this guy, Alexis Tsipras, who proved to be a very, very gifted politician. He took the message to Paris. He took it to Berlin. He was able to get political parties representing about 10 or 12% of the vote in France and in Germany to come on his side. And they can now form a faction in the European Parliament that can fight to take control of the European Central Bank. Because in Europe, you've got to do it internationally, right? U.S. is a little bit different, but not as different as you think. So we mentioned program. We mentioned an organization. We mentioned leadership. And then there's the question of having a strategy. And the strategy is sort of what I said before. Don't be sucked into the Republican Party or any Republican politician. Same thing for the Democrats, right? Keep yourself, as in terms of the integrity of your organization, you're separate from them. You're not them, and you don't want to be them. The other thing is don't make rotten compromises. Never, never, never join a coalition where you say, I'll take part in genocidal cuts against working people as the price for getting into this. Because if you do that, you're discredited, and that's the view. So those 4 or 5 things: program, organization, leadership, and a strategy. Now, we don't have that. People have, in the past year, people on the left and the right have wasted their time on various alternatives that turned out to be absolutely counterproductive. So you got to put away the anarchist ideology. You got to put away the right wing or whatever ideology that is, libertarianism, and get real. And real, again, is study something that actually worked. And Syriza, I think, worked in the sense it mounted a serious combative opposition to the ruling class policies, and it began to show a way out of it. The program that they had, we probably don't need to go through their program. Let's focus on the program you need for the United States. We have an emergency now, right? This is a depression. As you're saying, it is getting worse. The events in terms of the finance collapse, I think they interest me less than the impact that those have on people's lives, right? On the rate of foreclosures, the standard of living collapsing, the hunger and lack of medical care, things like this. Morbidity and mortality. People are dying much faster than they should. So this is what we have to address first. Now, the first, basically for the U.S., you have about 5 complexes, and the fifth we can just talk about a little bit at the end, the international economics part. But mainly, you got to do 4 big things. Now, each of these things has various parts to it. But the first part is the anti-austerity, anti-cuts. And again, it means austerity is genocide. You have 50 million Americans. They have no job, or they're a dependent of somebody who has no job. So 30 million, you get up to 50 million. They have no health care. That's another 50 million. They don't have welfare. Normally, mothers and children would have had welfare. Clinton got rid of that. So it's bipartisan on the demolition side. And they're in dire poverty. So the one thing they live on is food stamps. About 48, 49 million Americans are on food stamps. Now, anybody who proposes cutting that for any reason is advocating genocide against the American people. And it's out of this world. And we have the Republicans in the House now. They say they want to cut $32 billion, and now they've gone down to $6 billion. And the Democrats in the Senate say, oh, we only want to cut it by $5 to $6 billion. Those are all Nuremberg indictments. Anybody who proposes that stuff should be reminded that there was a Nuremberg court where people, they paid a heavy price for doing things like that, because there's no difference. The ultimate logic of austerity is a concentration camp. Basically saying, we're going to lower your living standard to the point where you're going to work you so hard. We're not only going to steal the gold from your teeth, we're going to take the calories that are in your body and use those. And when you're down, to nothing, then we'll throw you on the junk heap, and that's the end of you. So the first basic point is no cuts in anything. No cuts in Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment benefits, S-chip, Head Start. No cuts. This was the main point in the Syriza agitation, and it would have to be the beginning point anywhere in the world. No more cuts. The bankers caused this crisis. They can pay. Who should pay for the depression? Working people or rich parasites? Bankers. Now, when you say bankers, and we'll get to in a second, you're not so much talking about taxing them as individuals, although there's nothing wrong with that, but it's mainly Wall Street turnover. In other words, if we're talking about 2 quadrillion of derivatives in Wall Street and a turnover which is probably 4, 5, 6 quadrillion, we don't know, buying and selling of the 2 quadrillion, the obvious question with that is what kind of sales tax are they paying? And they're paying nothing. So they're like the French aristocracy before the French Revolution of 1789. Wall Street pays no taxes. They pay nothing on the buying and selling that they do, and they pay nothing GE, right, under Immelt, General Electric, which is a hedge fund, not an industrial corporation, has paid basically no tax that entire time. So you want to maintain the social safety net. And again, that's simply a matter of maintaining your labor power. The reason you want to do it is obviously you can't have the descent into barbarism. You can't have people dying. But you've also got to, from the point of view of a nation, you got to say we need to have a qualified labor force. And if we don't maintain our, for example, university education, soon we won't have a qualified labor force anymore. The Chinese will eat us alive. If you want to follow some of these recipes, you got to factor in the cost of learning Chinese so you can take orders. If you don't want to take orders in Chinese, you better get ready to fund a whole series of programs. So the entire New Deal, New Frontier, Great Society social safety net has got to be maintained. Now, the point about that is not that people should live on food stamps and unemployment benefits, because this is not the goal. It's an emergency stabilization so that people don't die. And, for example, Medicare for all, right? Just throw it all open, say everybody who wants to can have Medicare, $100 per person per month. And if you're broke, if you're destitute, and if you're unemployed, then it basically goes down to zero. So a series of measures like this. The second point then is look at speculative capital, so-called. In other words, fictitious capital. Not all capital is real. And if you have a locomotive, if you have a drill press, if you have scientific equipment, that's a capital good. That's real. But a lot of what is called capital today, capital formation, is derivatives. And these have no value. As a matter of fact, they have negative value. You have to pay somebody to take them to the shredder.
So, Webster, what do you do to the counterfeit market that threatens to overthrow the real economy?
Well, one thing we've already talked about is banning the most dangerous kinds of derivatives, right? We know that credit default swaps destroyed AIG. We know that collateralized debt obligations came, very close and would have destroyed virtually every other bank in Wall Street. Bear Stearns, Goldman Sachs, they were all bankrupt. Citibank, Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase. So ban the worst derivatives and slap a 1 cent on the dollar tax on all others. For individuals, by the way, if you're worried about your, trading for your retirement account, we could have a allowance of $1 million per person, free, right, free of charge, so that if you have to, buy and sell some stocks for your own purposes, that's fine. You won't be taxed. But once you get into the high frequency trading, flash trading, program trading, 1 million transactions per second, well, you got to see if they're doing 1 million transactions per second and 1 penny goes to the federal treasury for each one of those, that activity is going to die down considerably. It's going to be limited to things that have a real economic purpose. I would say a lot of the over-financialization, the casino economy can best be dealt with a simple idea. We pay sales tax 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11% in California now. That's a regressive tax. That's not the kind of tax you want. Let Wall Street bear their share of the burden. Those are not capital markets anymore. Those are gambling dens. So that's one way to do it. The other obvious thing is end too big to fail. Zombie banks cannot have a claim on the resources of society, be it the U.S. Treasury or the Federal Reserve. They got to have a social purpose. They don't have one. So let them go down. Put them through Chapter 11, more likely Chapter 7, forced liquidation. Get rid of the zombie banks. And when you do it, all the derivatives that they contain get destroyed. In other words, that's what a bankruptcy judge does. He distinguishes between obligations of the bankrupt firm that can be maintained and others that can't be. So the ones that have to be triaged are always the derivatives. Then you get into some of the things I was talking about before. You got to regulate commodities markets. Again, it's mostly a return to the New Deal regulatory regime, Glass-Steagall, right? You don't want to have commercial banks and investment banks or brokerages and insurance companies together. So you got to re-separate those, right? It's too late to avoid the panic with that, but you can do that to avoid the next panic bubble. So I think you get the idea. If you do this, you're going to be reducing the specific gravity of finance in general in the society, and you're going to essentially lift huge burdens. For example, in some cases, when it comes to foreclosures, the obvious thing to do is to say, well, the banks that have issued these foreclosures cannot be allowed to loot the society because we want to save human society. They were bailed out by taxpayers, and now they're going to do a favor to the American people. We're going to have a ban on foreclosures for 5 years or the duration of the world economic crisis, whichever lasts longer. So that's your second point. You got to cut the fictitious capital that's crushing the world, and it means ways to attack zombie banks and ways to attack this tremendous cancer of derivatives, and also re-regulation that will prevent the hedge fund hyenas from doing their work, people like Romney. Now, the third one is this question of the Federal Reserve. You cannot have the Federal Reserve under private control. A lot of it is privately owned, and a lot of it is privately controlled. And the only way you can avoid that under our system is if the activities of the Federal Reserve are controlled by the Congress, by bills that originate in the House, get passed by the Senate, and are signed by the president. If you don't want to have a more far-reaching revolution, which I would not propose, then you have to have the constitutional remedy to the Federal Reserve, is that this is reserved to Congress. So it means let the Congress, with public laws, specify how much credit, how many trillions of credit will be given out, what the interest rates will be for the various categories, and what the approved categories of lending are. So what I'm saying is nationalize the Federal Reserve, federalize the Federal Reserve, seize the Federal Reserve. Don't destroy it, because if you destroy it, you've done a favor to Wall Street, because from the Wall Street perspective, the Federal Reserve is a regulator. It interferes with them, right, in terms of their daily activity. It's not like they're in love with the Federal Reserve. They'd like to go back to the time when there was no Federal Reserve and they could do absolutely anything that they wanted. So make the Federal Reserve a national bank of the United States. Make it the fourth bank of the United States.
So that's Hamiltonian view.
Hamiltonian all the way. And the Hamiltonian because that was successful, right? As it was, without the Bank of the United States would not have survived the first 20 years. As soon as the second Bank of the United States was gone, thanks to Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren, you go into the crash of 1837, the worst depression that we'd ever had. A lot of states go bankrupt, right? About a third of the states in the Union went bankrupt. Economic development slowed down. Railroad building slowed. Canal building slowed compared to...
Got it. Okay, so let's move to point 4.
Okay, so, but here's the thing now. We want to say to the central bank, national bank, up to now, you've been doing 0% credit for zombie banks and hedge fund hyenas only. We're telling you to stop that. We're now
do it for the American people and small business.
For production. Yeah, yep. But not any kind of small business. Production. And we know what production means, right? Industry. Tangible physical wealth. Commodity production, assembly lines, building things.
Textiles, machinery, electronics, computers, firearms, mining.
Farming, energy production. There's a tangible physical result. Also, scientific research, I would say, now has to go for production. So you're basically saying we're going to have a Main Street window, and if you have a restaurant, dry cleaning, an auto repair shop, anything where there's a tangible physical product, not financial services, you can get a 0% loan. Now, the problem with that is that would, in theory, be enough to have a recovery, but it won't be, because in the depressed economy, people are afraid. They're afraid that if they invest, they're going to lose their money. So you got to take it one step further. And that's now going to be my fourth point. This is the defibrillator. You've got to have a massive program of public works infrastructure. This has been done under many, many circumstances around the world. We had it in the New Deal, kept the U.S. going through the 1930s. You basically say the states... Or let's put it another way. We'll start from the new national bank. The head of the U.S. National Bank, who is really the Secretary of the Treasury, right, says, we're putting out a tender offer. We want all the states to come forward with infrastructure projects, right? We know what we need. The Texas T-bone, the California maglev and fast rail. We need the new tunnel under the Hudson River between New York and New Jersey that Christie doesn't want to build. We need the new Howard Street tunnel in Baltimore so that double-decker container trains can go from the deepwater port of Baltimore to the rest of the U.S., right? Similar things in Norfolk, similar port. We've got a rail system which is collapsing, be it freight, passenger, or commuter. We've got a electricity grid, which is always on the verge of collapse. We've got schools where I think almost half of U.S. schools are now 50 years old or more, and on and on. We lost 1,000 hospitals over the past 3 to 4 decades, got to rebuild all of those. So what you're essentially saying is to the states is, states, you states issue bonds. We're telling you to make them 0% interest rate, 0% interest for free. 100-year maturities, century bonds just issued. Caltech just issued some. They're smart. They issued century bonds. The National Bank is going to buy those bonds. They're all earmarked for useful physical infrastructure. And with those, we'll give you $1 trillion to start with, right? I call it a terror tranche. $1 trillion tranche or segment of credit goes out to the states. And then once that's gone, it's going to be a revolving fund. We'll do another $1 trillion. Because remember, the essence of a national bank is it's a credit system. You manufacture money out of thin air. That's exactly what you do. It's the power of the state, the credit of the United States government. It is the most powerful institution in the world, in spite of everything. If it were well managed, it would be even more powerful. It certainly doesn't need to go groveling and begging to the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, and these other parasitical bankrupt bankers. Imagine you're going to go to Wall Street and beg those guys to lend you money when the only reason they exist is thanks to federal government bailouts. I mean, what's the point? Eliminate them from the equation. Go to a credit system, and you make this available. So what are you going to do?
Webster, we're almost out of time. And no, hold on. I'm going to let you finish your points.
Okay.
Let me add one little point here. We've got to hurry up and finish your other points now. And then I've got a few closing comments and questions here, but please continue.
You want to rebuild the entire interstate highway system and all bridges. You got to rebuild the entire railway system as fast rail or maglev, and that includes a tremendous expansion of urban mass transit, commuter rail. You got to have a freight rail system. There's a whole immense amount of work to be done on the canals, right? You go into the Tennessee River, Ohio River, places like this. The locks on the canals are breaking down so that the coal can't be shipped. And obviously, we got to keep those coal mines open, as you were saying, right? The rail, the road, the water projects and canals. You got to rebuild the entire electricity grid, and you got to use the most modern form of electricity generation you can find. And I'm afraid solar cells and windmills just won't do it. So you take it from there. Then you've got to do public buildings. You got schools, hospitals, government buildings. You go to any place in the Midwest or any rural place you want, it's going to say Works Progress Administration or Public Works Administration on the City Hall and so forth. Housing, yeah, there's got to be low-cost urban housing, and that could certainly be done much more. You've also got to make sure there's plenty of credit available, for example, for kids who want to go to college, right? Why do we have to pay 3.4% on a federal Stafford loan for somebody to go to college when a zombie banker gets it for 0%? Let's turn the tables. Let's have 0% for kids who want to go to college, and they can pay that back over 30 or 40 years at 0%. So you get the idea. Your goal is to create 30 million new productive jobs at union wages, well paid, not slave labor, not workfare, none of this garbage, high capital investment per job, right? If you give somebody a rake and tell them to go rake leaves, then your capital investment per job is like $10, right? That's a bad joke. The idea with the U.S. is this country has been successful as a high-wage economy, high capital intensity, high energy intensity.
Sure,
right?
let me throw a point in here. I mean, the system is at war against high wage. People don't understand. You just say you have high wages, suddenly there's more money, all real business and service does better. The oligarchs are waging war on that because they're waging war on the real economy. I mean, I get your point along these lines. We're going to finish your final point here in a moment. But, Webster, how do you stop the oligarchs who want all the free credit for themselves but don't want us to have the free credit? And if somehow talk about giving the public free credit is bad, but giving offshore eugenics-based banks free credit, I mean, you talk about power. If we just got them off our back, we'd be fine. Obama and his globalist controllers are shutting down 1/3 of our power plants right now.
Yeah, see, power is going to go somewhere. And if you don't want them to have power, in other words, Wall Street controls the federal government. That's the essence of the problem. If you don't want that power to go to Wall Street, then you've got to take it yourself. And again, look at Syriza in Greece. If they could go from 4% of the votes to 27% of the votes, we could do something similar here. You look at both major parties agree with austerity, right? Democrats say we want mild austerity. Republicans say we want genocidal austerity. Austerity, the same thing. 80%, 4/5 of the American people say we don't want any cuts in Medicare. You get similar things for Medicaid and for Social Security. Tremendous majorities, 2/3, 3/4, 4/5 say no, hands off our economic rights. If you decide to butt your head against this, it's pointless, and it's economically and politically counterproductive. You've got to have a mass movement that can take power. Now, you look around the world, you'll see governments everywhere are very, very vulnerable. They're all very unstable. Why not? Why not here? If Greece can do something along these lines and actually become a contender for power and maybe take power in the next election, what's preventing it here? Because they're crippled by right-wing libertarian ideology on the one hand and this anarchist, ad busters, Occupy Wall Street. The last point, the fifth point, is international economics. Now, I can't go through this, just 2 points about this. One is you're going to need a protective tariff. In other words, if you have all these guys who are exporting the jobs, right? Romney sends jobs overseas. How do you stop that? Well, one way, you're obviously going to tax it, right? Instead of giving a tax bonus for exporting a job, you want to have a tax penalty for exporting a job. But the other thing is you put up a modest protective tariff of 15 or 20%. It changes the entire picture. How can Americans be expected to compete with coolie labor, right? With low-wage sweatshop labor
in India,
in the third world. We don't want that. Why do we have to have that? Who voted for globalization? I never did. We don't want globalization. We're sick of it.
What's sick of it is the globalists brag that they designed it to implode all the economies, not to build up. That's the big lie.
So let's forget the slogans of the libertarian right and the anarchist left and get down to things that really attack the essence of finance capital. The other thing is there is a role for gold in all of this, right? Gold in Bretton Woods had a very important function. It functioned as a kind of reality principle. Not that your credit issue was limited to gold. No. There's not enough gold for that. And we don't want to be deflationary, because that's the problem of going to a gold standard of that kind is you get tremendous deflation. Very, very bad. Look at American history in the late 19th century, right? The whole cross of gold. This was really, really bad. But the positive role of gold under the Bretton Woods system is you want to have gold settlement. In other words, at the end of a year or a couple of years or whatever it is, after all the buying and selling and all the, the exchange and going back and forth, two countries are either going to have a deficit or a surplus. And at that point, there is the possible demand to say, you should pay us in gold, not for every transaction, but for the netting, right? The clearing of that entire thing. That's an important reality principle, because the way that the U.S. slipped into this financier control was when the gold convertibility was lifted by Nixon on August 15th, 1971. This meant that the U.S. could just go wild, right?
But there you go. That's exactly what Lew Rockwell, who you would see as somebody you disagree with, said today. He marks that as the time that the banksters fully took over. So do you, but you're diametrically opposed to what he's saying.
Because what he wants to do is to go to a gold coin standard. We have 3 examples of a gold coin standard going back. The British went back to a gold coin standard in 1815, and that's the world of the Dickensian treadmill. A tremendous poverty, tremendous cruelty. The British did it again in the 1920s under Sir Winston Churchill. They went back on the gold standard. The biggest unemployment in world history was in Britain, of an advanced country, was in Britain in the 1920s, and the United States. After the Civil War, we had a very successful greenback system, which worked fine and should have been kept. But the gold...
Webster, I get the fact that if you have free credit or near free credit issued by the state, it cuts out the banksters, it energizes economies, but it also brings its own fraudulent bubbles as well. None of this is a panacea. My issue is the banksters, the oligarchs, the Anglo-American establishment are genocidal eugenicists who have this survival of the fittest social Darwinian view that is not reality-based. So they are the prime enemy. I look at almost anything as better than what they've got.
Yeah, but they're eugenicists, but they're austerity fiends. Right now, it's the austerity
because that brings in their eugenics. That brings in their eugenics, yeah.
And then they say, we'll create a world where you will die and we will triumph. Well, the answer to that is no. And here's a mass movement that says no. And I would urge people, your audience, right, might be a good starting point for some of this, right? We've got to build a broad front. I'm talking about national anti-austerity committees meeting starting in September, because here's what it's going to be. In December, we're going to have the fiscal cliff. This is a Republican slogan, reactionary slogan. Democrats have bought into it. So we're going to have the fiscal cliff, and there's going to be the pressure to have a grand bargain. And the grand bargain is going to be the two political parties, both of them, getting ready, turning on the American people and saying, we're going to flay the American people alive with austerity cuts. We're going to take away economic rights that have been acquired by centuries of labor struggles.
But it's worse than that. It's worse than
struggles.
that. I mean, here's my next question, because now you've had your long 30 minutes breaking this down, and I really find it thought-provoking. How do we deal with a ruling class that raises taxes? Obama says you make a $125,000 a year, $250,000 husband and wife. You're rich. We're going to raise your tax. While Mitt Romney and the rest of them are tax exempt, wrote the laws offshore.
What you do is you agitate for your own tax. In other words, if you say no cuts in Social Security, no cuts in Medicare, and unlimited unemployment for 99 weeks and beyond, the 99ers and everybody else. The next question that I ask you is, oh, and how are you going to pay for that? By taxing Wall Street, by taxing Wall Street turnover. We want 1% coming out of every one of those flash trades at 1 million transactions per second. That's how we pay for it. In other words, it is also true that you could tax the 1% much more than they're taxed already, and this would not be enough to really even begin to deal with the needs of the social safety net.
Yeah, but they break down those actuaries in the fake 1% that keeps their money here, who's not ultra elite and exempt like Google and General Electric offshore. I mean, the truth is they've got how many 30-something trillion they admit offshore they won't bring in, and then they've got hundreds of other trillions.
Hey, let's have, in the New Deal, there was a really good thing, an undistributed profits tax. In other words, if you want to hoard money, and they say, the companies in the U.S. have $3 trillion. Oh, and they're so afraid. They don't have confidence. They don't have certainty. They're afraid to invest. Let's help them to invest. Let's say if you don't invest it, you're going to pay a 5 to 10% undistributed profits tax, and let's supplement that with an offshore tax, right? In other words, if you have an offshore account, we're going to have, we want 5 or 10% of that going to the federal treasury. And when I say the federal treasury, for most of these things, it's half for the feds, half for the states, because the states are the ones who've got to maintain the highways and the education systems and through the municipalities, right? The obvious things, the fire department.
Well, Webster, here's the problem. Listen, I understand the engine of wealth, of productivity, of human ingenuity, of machines. We could all live like kings and queens. The oligarchs understand that. Their instinct is shut it down, keep us in squalor, keep us poor. My issue is, you get 60 million people on food stamps. All this happens. That's actually what the establishment wants.
No,
they have
not anymore.
Yeah.
No. They want to throw you off because they want you to die. See, this is the difference, right? Obama says to the ruling class, keep me. I'm killing them, slowly on the installment plan. I'm making them die the death of 1,000 cuts. It's gradual. The resistance is minimal. He betrayed these guys in Wisconsin, wouldn't fight for them. And the ruling class says, no, it's too slow. We want the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, right? We want a machine gun. We want the atomic bomb on these entitlements because we're not paying, because we're the goddamn ruling class. So at that point, Obama out, they think, Romney in. Now, Romney is so inept that he may not be able to win even with the backing of the ruling class. This is now quite possible, and you can see it. But the ruling elite says, we're done with entitlements, right? You have no economic rights. We are going to flay you alive. Obama is just, he's getting in the way.
That's my final question here. Webster, you've got 1.4 billion bullets being bought, clear tyranny being rolled out. You're acting like they're inept. No, they got a plan to shut things down and take over, get everything with their corporate welfare, and they're gearing up to... I've got Army documents that they admit are real for re-education camps, mass arrest. I mean, it's like Kim Jong-il took
important principle of strategy is you can't run after every deployment of the enemy. You know, every time you get, you know, beat up by the screeners in an airport, that's not a strategy to respond to that. Your strategy has to be step back, look at the society, analyze the crisis, and say, what's the one point where an attack with limited forces would win, transform the entire thing?
Let me stop you there. I want to hear your one point, but I get you on and respect you and are nice to you, but I've been able, by myself, I know Obama says I didn't build anything, to build up quite an organization with focus, picking the right people and hard work, alternative media out of nowhere to reach millions a day. Webster, the TSA, groping our sons and daughters and wives and husbands, has been a unifier. The globalists meant it to be something that broke our backs, to train us to accept any form of degradation and humiliation. It has been a unifying factor to bring people together. Other things have been a unifying factor.
So where's the result? Where's the mass movement with a program and the self-conscious urge to take power? Look, you can see it. I'm sure you could see it with the leftists, right? Once you get into Zuccotti Park, the anarchists are there. They say, oh, we got to fight the cops. Let's fight the cops.
Well, that's the controllers manipulating them.
It's pointless. But the other one, the right-wing version, is just as pointless. In other words, if that's all you're doing, right, if you're inveighing, abolish the TSA, you're spinning your wheels. It doesn't lead to anything. It's pointless.
Webster.
It's a blind alley.
Webster, look, total education, total information. That's what's going to give people the tools to decide what they think's right. I cover the waterfront. But here's the deal. I see Warren Buffett on ABC News every weekend promoting taxes, taxes, taxes. I see the oligarchs promoting taxes so they can get corporate welfare. So how do you reach out to libertarians and conservatives and explain that the globalists have made themselves exempt from their own laws to pick winners and losers?
You have to talk to these right-wing libertarians in the same way you talk to a left-wing anarchist who's been duped by Adbusters and Graeber. You've got to change your ways. In other words, you're on a path to defeat. It's not working. None of this stuff is going to be decisive. Decisive is, I mean, if you want to boil it down to one demand, it's probably something, at the present time, it's probably no cuts or in anything paid for by a Wall Street sales tax of 1% on all Wall Street turnover. In other words, tax Wall Street, make the bankers pay. So it's a fighting class-based slogan. Otherwise, you're going to be protesting as the society collapses. There are a million things to protest, right? But you got to see what's the root cause. It's being caused by the Depression. Depression leads to dictatorship. Dictatorship leads to world war. And the German experience was, there's no point in telling people Hitler is bad, wrote a guy, as long as the unemployment is so high and the deflation is so bad, he's gaining, right? So you got to learn the lesson, right? Learn something.
I got it. Hitler had a program other people didn't. So let me no, it's until you could solve the problem of unemployment, the Nazis were going to gain. So it's the same thing we have today. As long as there's a depression like this, the institutions are crumbling. What the society is looking for is they want to see a force, a political agency, a power that can say, I have the answers and I want to take power. But Webster, the public is under scientific manipulation by television. The average person is in a dream state.
You're counteracting it. You're counteracting it, right? So you got to say to people, look, the TSA, I think you've covered the TSA. How about covering some labor struggles, right? How about those guys who were up in Wisconsin, right, fighting the fascist governor? There are fascist governors. The biggest tin pot dictator we have is Governor Snyder of Michigan. He's a fascist. He wants to send dictators to control cities, right? Benton Harbor, Flint, and all these places, right? The Detroit school system. And he does it. He's a Republican thug, and he imposes austerity, and also he uses it to loot it for his rich friends. So there's a
no. I understand. It's always austerity for everybody with the fat
populism,
cats. So even
populism means you're fighting the ruling class because you want to do something for working people, not to them, not strip them of their rights, right? Not take away 63% of their food stamps when that's all they have to live on. That's insane.
Sure, Webster, let me just stop you right there for just a moment and expand on this, here at the close. As a historian, as a researcher, as an economist, because you've certainly accurately predicted what would come. If the establishment has their way, where would the world be in 10 years? What do they want to do versus other ideas? What do you expect to happen if this course isn't changed? In closing.
I tell you, it's like Jimmy Stewart when he comes back to Pottersville, right? Rottenville, after he decided, let's see what it would look like if I had never lived. The United States will look something like this. There'll be no unions, no unemployment benefits, no Social Security, no Medicare, no Medicaid, no S-chip, no Head Start. There'll be no child labor laws. College will be for the 1%, as it was, say, in the 1920s. Most people will rent. They will not own because they will have been stripped of their homes. Rich people will live in fortified, not even gated, but fortified communities. Most people will live in slums. Social order will break down. And the Chinese will be looking down on us from the moon, from Chinese permanent moon colonies and maybe even Mars colonies, where they'll be engaged in industrial production. And the United States will be essentially collapsing as a low-wage economy because, once again, we have an incompetent ruling class. The stupidity of David Rockefeller, the stupidity of Steve Forbes, the cretinism of these people is so overwhelming that they can't understand that the existence of the United States in some recognizable form of civilization, this is not automatic. This is now in danger. And the thing that's bringing it down is the depression, and then the response of the ruling class to the depression, which is to say, cut it more. Let's act out our austerity psychosis, and let's flay the people alive. Then we'll have money we can pay for new rounds of bailouts.
Well, yeah, that's the thing, is that they make money off corporate welfare and cronyism controlling the government. They know when they raise taxes on the general public, it cuts benefits. So it's just an instinct to dominate and ground us down, seeing us as a political threat. But in truth, they're destroying the economy that empowered their system to begin with.
Right. And remember, the one thing we know about oligarchy is oligarchs, going back to the time of the Trojan War, right? The official explanation for the Trojan War that we find in the fragments of Hesiod. Too many people. Got to have a big war to kill people. And then in the writings of the old oligarch in 400 or 500 BC there in Athens, the old oligarch says he doesn't like the Navy because the Navy is high tech and the Navy allows upward social mobility for the masses, and he doesn't like that because oligarchs want a frozen social order. That's the other thing. In that future picture, the social mobility will be zero. In other words, if you're born in the bottom 20%, your chances of going to the top 40 or the top 20 will be zero because you can forget it because there'll be no college for you. There'll be no Pell Grants.
So basically they're a bunch of dark age stagnant worshipers.
Right.
All right, final question.
And their ideology. I mean, it's the Austrian school, the Chicago school, monetarism, neoliberalism. I mean, they have an economic theory, and it's wrong, and it's genocide.
All right, Webster, we've gone for well over an hour and 10 minutes. In closing, before we went on air tonight, during the first little break there from the news, you brought up the fact that you had been at this New World Fair, and you mentioned Zeitgeist, and I said, what is your view of Zeitgeist? Because I get calls all the time saying Zeitgeist has been seen 50 million times or so. He put me in the first film, put you in the first film. They talk about a master planning computer. We live in these plastic cities. The head of it told me, he said, if I didn't agree with what they wanted, I would be put in re-education. So maybe I do need re-education, but what's your view on that?
I've always been skeptical. I was puzzled. They put me into their first film. That must have been about, 2007, 5 years ago now. And the goal of that first film was They said they wanted 9/11 truth, but then it turned out that they had a double goal. They said, we want 9/11 truth and atheism. And half of that first film is all about atheism, which I find to be a stupid, counterproductive, just wrong approach. It's also, you know, it's offensive, right? What the hell does this have to do with anything? And that was typical of a lot of people who tried to mix in their own pet shtick into 9/11 truth. I haven't really followed them very much since then because I've had a relatively dark view. But I believe they also promote peak oil, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, they do. And Z-Day is going to save us. We're all going to throw our money in the water, and then we're all going to live in the plastic city where a computer programmed by Goldman Sachs, but they don't mention that, will tell us what we get. Sounds as close as to hell as we can get.
Yeah, I think as soon as they say peak oil, you can forget it, right? I mean, anybody who promotes peak oil is just, it's so dumb, and it's so obviously inspired by the ruling class, right? It's this group of, again, Darwinians.
They're saying, get ready for austerity, get ready for Malthusianism. You're poor because it's sexy, like the Whole Foods magazines say. It's like
it's like a cheering, groupies, cheerleaders for ruling class austerity to say you shouldn't want to have a car, or you shouldn't want to have.
It's like saying the Athenian Navy is too high tech.
Yeah, so I think the Malthusian inspiration for this is obviously a very bad thing. Anybody who professes peak oil is just a crackpot. You can forget them on just about every other issue, in many cases anyway. So I would stay away. The one thing I did notice at this New World Fair event, there were all kinds of people from Zeitgeist trying to organize people, right? They were like missionaries all over this gathering. It was not a big gathering. People can take a look at my website, tarpley.net. I gave a speech which talked about some of these organizing perspectives. In other words, how we got to get ready.
But I thought Z-Day was going to, here's the deal. I invited Peter Joseph as stage name or whatever on like a year ago. I said, look, we fought 5-6 years ago. I want to have you back on. And he said, fine, but you must renounce that I ever said you're going to go to a re-education camp. Or that I would be re-educated. And he sent me the video, and I went and looked at it. Like he says on the video that, but I was like, he was like, no, I didn't. You must renounce it. And I was like, well, fine. You're all powerful, and everything. I will not renounce it. I will not. I'm a heretic. But he did say that, and I just saw with the communist in people, it was always spaceships and technology and what they do, and always these kind of promises of heaven, Valhalla. And, I mean, it's a waning thing anyways. It's just that, I see comments, and if you talk about it, the acolytes get very, very angry that you're not following. I mean, look, it sounds like hell to live in some big plastic dome city where a computer decides what you get and what you do. I mean, I'm kind of into free will. I know that's bad, but...
No, absolutely, free will. Free will is the starting point for any reasonable explanation. I would just say maybe this movement is not important enough to be concerned about. The one thing we can say, though, is as the depression gets worse,
you're going to have more and more groups trying to go
irrationalist movements of all sorts, and they will become a useful political commodity for the bankers, right? Who can use them, and that's the danger. You don't want to have crazy irrationalist crackpot mass movements.
No, I hear you. Tarpley, I think that's like an hour and 20 minutes. Thank you so much for all the time. I think people really got to hear your ideas.
Glad to do it. Thank you.
It was great having you. It's getting dark there, and they're in Maryland. It's going to get dark here soon, too. Thank you for joining us.
We're in the twilight of empire, but we're still fighting.
Oh, you know what? Let's just go even further here. I'm going to give you, if you'll do it in the twilight, so it'll get dark while you're on air, 10 minutes. Uninterrupted. Tell us about Paul Ryan. Tell us about Kolob. I mean, tell us what you were telling me before we went live on air. Because, I mean, I'm being mean to Zeitgeist. I might as well be mean to children of Kolob right now.
All right. You have, first of all, Mitt Romney, right, the Republican candidate. And anybody can see he's a hedge fund hyena. He's a corporate raider. He's an asset stripper. I think the actual technical term for Mitt Romney is asset stripper. In other words, you buy companies, you sell off the pieces, you wreck them, you load them with debt, then they go bankrupt and you walk away with these huge sums of money. And this is facilitated by the U.S. tax code, because the money that Romney got in this Bain capital phase, which is from the early 80s, it's about 20 years. It's from about 1983, 84 to 2002. He got a sweetheart tax rate on that through something called carried interest. And carried interest says it's a capital gain. It's carried interest. So 15% in many cases, right? Whereas if he'd been, paying tax on wages, right, would be 35% for a lot of that time, different wage rates. So that's Romney. Now, he does represent this Mormon political operation, right? There's a tremendous amount to be said about the Mormons. It's a church that was founded as a separate country. It's not American. It's not Christian. It's not Judaism. It's not Islam. It's none of those. And it's not American. It's not the United States of America. It was to create an entity, a separate country, eventually called Deseret, which would be a power set apart from and hostile to the United States. And if you read the Joseph Smith White Horse prophecy, what he has in there in the early 1830s is he says the white horse of Mormonism is going to combine with the red horse, the British, the London banks, against the pale horse, the United States. So you get it's a pincers where between the British Empire and the Mormons out there in the Great Basin, the United States is going to be crushed. Now, then this is inherent in it from the beginning. It's a theocracy. They say self-government under a constitution is blasphemy. It's inherently impossible. God doesn't want it, right? We want to have a theocracy. It's very similar to Al-Qaeda, right? Al-Qaeda's rap is every government in the Arab world is illegitimate because it's not the caliphate, because it's not the kingdom of God on earth. Well, similarly with the Mormons. So eventually they create this Deseret entity, and in 1857, over the issue of polygamy, right, because Brigham Young had 70 wives or 80 wives, Joseph Smith between 35 and 85 wives, thereabouts. Nobody else in all of Western civilization has polygamy, but they do. It's a very peculiar reading of the, not even of the Bible, but of their own particular texts.
Well, it sounds like hell to me.
Yeah, it's, many jokes have been made about this, right? Why would you want this? So, but there are reasons. In other words, it's a system of brutal crushing of women. You want to talk about war on women? Look at Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. Now, Romney belongs to the ultra elite of this church, not through the Romney family so much, but through the Pratt family. Romney, as he tells you in his autobiographies, campaign autobiographies, ghostwritten usually, Romney wants to tell you his great-great-grandfather was Parley P. Pratt. Parley Pratt. And this was, after Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, probably the most important and most popular among the Mormons leader. He became a polygamist. He went to Britain with Brigham Young. One of the things I think you have to grasp about the Mormons is as that prophecy indicates, the Mormons understand themselves as an ally of the British Empire against the United States. In other words, you got the British fleet off the East Coast, and out in the Intermountain West, you've got this theocratic power which is opposed to the United States, Deseret, ultimately Brigham Young. In 1857, he takes it all the way, and he basically says, I'm seceding. I'm an independent country. And the idea was, this is timed. They've obviously got access to British intelligence at a very high level, and they figure that the bleeding Kansas, the John Brown's raid and similar things, are going to turn into a civil war in 1858 or 1859. So they decide to get the ball rolling, which they actually did. And President Buchanan had to send an army, 1/3 of the U.S. Army, to try to reestablish federal authority in Utah. This is a very interesting point. The first time a U.S. president ever said the word terrorism is the proclamation of President James Buchanan in 1857, where he says, the Mormons have created a strange system of terrorism out there in the Great Basin. They are in a state of insurrection, and I'm sending 3,000 troops or whatever he had, a third of everything that he had, out there to reestablish federal authority. So this is done in close cooperation with the British. And
Webster, I'm going to have you back about this, because here's the deal. I have a lot of Mormon listeners who seem like good, hardworking, smart people who want freedom.
They may be.
Well, yeah. And I got to be honest with you. I have not had time to research this. I'm going to look into what you're saying, because it's wild. British intelligence, the Mormons. Yeah. I mean, I knew about the troops being sent out west and all this stuff. All I know is Romney was a deacon or a bishop or whatever it was a bishop?
Bishop.
Yeah,
Bishop Romney.
So my whole issue is, would he be loyal to the Republic or to his religion? But you go into that, who is Obama? I mean, these guys are puppets to begin with. And so my whole issue is, if Mitt Romney is a Mormon, that's more just from his family and a structure that helped launch him. All of his real actions is a minion to the global bankers.
Yes, but, I mean, let's go back to Obama. With Obama, we pointed out that he was a creature of this intelligence community foundation world. In other words, where the CIA meets the foundations, right? The world of counterinsurgency, the world of social control. And remember the famous speech with Obama where he says, there are these bitter clingers who cling to religion and guns and anti-trade, and they don't like globalization, and they cling to not liking people that are different from them. So they're racist. Okay. So you could see that Obama had an animus against large parts of the American people, right? Because this is the rap. Right, American people, reactionary, chauvinist, racist, no good. That's sort of a left-oligarch point of view. But now, the Mormon rap is the United States is guilty of the greatest crime in the history of the world. The United States allowed the killing of Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith and Parley Pratt. In the case of Parley Pratt, the story is he went to essentially, he got mixed up with a family in Arkansas, right? Parley Pratt already had 11 wives. He decided he wanted to have 12 wives. So he takes the wife of the woman from Arkansas. The husband runs after him and kills him, kills Parley Pratt, the number 2 or 3 Mormon in the world. The Arkansas court refuses to convict Parley Pratt. And at that point, when the Mormons secede in 1857 under Brigham Young, there's this group, it's called the Baker Fancher Party. It's 150 or so people from Arkansas who are just trying to go to California. They're on the old Spanish Trail. They're leaving Utah. They're headed to California. And it's pretty clear Brigham Young gives the order, and they're massacred. It's the biggest massacre in U.S. history other than 9/11 or Oklahoma City. Comes in third. And for many years, more than a century, it was number 1. So there's a tremendous animus of hatred. I can mention one thing, the so-called oath of vengeance. Right? Under Brigham Young was put into the liturgy, what they call the temple endowment of the Mormon Church, a proposition saying, I promise, and I'm paraphrasing now, to exact revenge on the United States of America and its people for what they did to Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith. And I will preach this to my children for 4 generations. Well, this was only removed from the liturgy in the late 1920s, about 1927. Plenty of time for George Romney, the father of Mitt, to have pledged the oath of vengeance against the United States. So I'm saying, you look at Obama, he's somebody who comes in with an animus against significant parts of the American people. It's not a good idea, huh?
Well, let me ask you this. Are you saying, I mean, they're all puppets, though. You're saying go for Obama?
I'm saying I did everything I could to educate people about Obama when they didn't know. Now, and you've done it too, people who want to about Obama can find out, right? They can look at these films. I wrote 2 books. I got nothing to add on Obama, but I'm telling you, people don't know the stuff that I'm finding about Romney and the Mormons, and I think this is equally scary, maybe worse, because this is now a blood feud. This is a vendetta, and what role this plays.
But what about the Mormon prophecy that a Mormon will become president and save the republic when it hangs by a thread?
That's called a coup. That's called a coup d'etat. That's the Joseph Smith. This is the white horse prophecy once again. It's the one that I was citing, right? Where the white horse of the Mormons and the red horse of the British gang up and take over the pale horse of the United States. That the United States is the bringer of death. I think that's too much. That's not accurate, right? That's not historically, that's not the story. There's part of it, but that's not the whole thing. The White Horse prophecy goes, at some time in the future, the Constitution will hang by a thread, and the Mormons, the saints, will take over the government with a theocracy, and they will then rule the world. And Joseph Smith created a secret council of 50, which is not the quorum of 12. In other words, it's not a Mormon church organization. It's a political organizing committee. It's like a strike committee, except it's a committee to take over the United States and then the world, as he said, right? He says, I'm going to have
but I'll say this. They now teach Romans 13 in churches, so I think all the Catholics and Baptists and everybody, when Mitt Romney is sworn in as president, will kneel to Mitt Romney and pledge to do whatever he says because it's of the Lord.
I don't think so. I mean, the difference is, see, some churches are old, sedate, sated, mainstream, whatever you want to call them. Most of the Christian churches would say, render unto Caesar what is Caesar and unto God what is God. The Mormons say, no, we want the kingdom of God. We want a theocracy.
Hey, Webster, I was being sarcastic. Obviously, the whole Bible is about standing up against corruption in government. I was just making a joke at people that tell me, do whatever government says because it's of the Lord. Those people might as well go to the devil. Webster, incredible hour, 20-plus minute interview. Tarpley.net. Thank you so much for the time.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Amazing. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that was a marathon interview here on Infowars Nightly News with Webster Griffin Tarpley. There he is. He's leaving now. Webster, thank you so much. This whole Mormon thing, I've tried to stay out of it, but Webster is a historian and has a lot for us. Maybe we'll have him on about that and have a debate with a Mormon or something. All I know is I just want these foreign banks to not run my country. And I'm concerned about what's happening in our nation. And I think everything Webster talked about is very informative. We should look into it all. And you should also check out the films that are free online, The Obama Deception, Fall of the Republic, and get the hard copies at InfoWarsShop.com. That also supports our broadcast and everything we're doing here. And don't forget, you get 6 memberships for the price of 1, $5.95 a month, PrisonPlanet.tv. Whether you agree with me or disagree or like part of it, don't like part of it, the point is it's free speech here. And this is alternative, independent media. So be sure and support us. Thanks to the crew for the great job they've done. And thank you to Paul Watson for hosting the news. Lord willing, I'll be back tomorrow, 11 a.m. Central, 12 noon Eastern for the syndicated radio show. And back tomorrow night, 7 p.m. for Infowars Nightly News. That's it for this edition